Early in the morning on the 7th of June 1987, Neil Kinnock hid his bitter disappointment at Labour's third successive election defeat and thanked his campaign team at party headquarters. The scale of the loss convinced him that his party had to undergo nothing short of a revolution.
Making change on the scale that we had to do it involved some risks. The risk that, as Margaret Thatcher put it, if they would abandon their most cherished policies in opposition, what will they do with their promises in government?
Keep fighting us.
Will we do that?
Keep fighting us.
All the way,
Keep fighting us.
I don't know any other way. Okay. But my view was that any risks attached to being accused of inconsistency and insincerity because of changing were much less than the awful price to be paid for not changing. And in any case, it was right to change.
I think the position taken by Labour's leaders in the late 80s and into the 90s was a position of surrender, or an acknowledgement that really we had lost the argument, that a Thatcherite hegemony had been established to which we could only accommodate. We couldn't change it fundamentally.
Kinnock was determined to take his party to the right, but for a man of the left, the move was bound to lead to his downfall.
His very drive, his what the gurus call the project for change, inevitably meant that he would actually be seen to have shifted over those crucial years the ground of the Labour Party. The mistrust, the uncertainty that created was in the end his downfall, but there was absolutely nothing that he could have done about that.
After 4 years as leader, Neil Kinnock had established himself as the absolute ruler of his party. He now ordered a far-reaching review to revamp Labour's policies. In his determination to drive the changes through, he crushed dissenters in the shadow cabinet with a ruthlessness reminiscent of his opponent, Margaret Thatcher.
I think you become convinced you're right. And when there are many people against you, it's like a captain on a ship. You have to make your decisions, and they're very lonely decisions. And Neil used to feel a lot of people ducked the decisions, and he had to make them, and he had great courage for it. But I felt sometimes he got caught up with being too courageous, and sometimes the political judgment was affected by that. And you were either with him or against him, and that applied to an awful lot of us, and that is if you were at all critical.
Right, sir.
I think Neil became absolutely obsessed, and understandably, perhaps rightly, with the notion of winning. He became a very powerful leader, which was very much at odds with the public image of him as a sort of bumbling incompetent who couldn't make up his mind about things.
1, 2, 3!
He became very impatient and scornful of people who objected in any way to the course he'd mapped out, the course he saw as leading to victory. Of course, he was helped in his attitude by the support of many of those on the right who, in any case, wanted to abandon old commitments.
You walk with Douglas.
It was often said at Westminster that Margaret Thatcher had more influence on the left than any Labour politician. To Neil Kinnock, Many of her policies seemed irreversible, and Labour had to adapt to them. Britain was more affluent, increasingly middle class. An influential group of colleagues agreed.
I mean, the Kinnock camp was a good camp to be in because it actually started addressing the voters' needs. So it isn't a question of signing up to something that's kind of, you know, sexy or clever or mainstream or on a roll. It's realpolitik. It's about, if you want political power, you cannot ignore where people are, and you can't say, oh, you know, the electorate are wrong because they all want their own house, or they all want to go on continental holidays, or they care more about going to movies. That's the real world.
The policy review began with a polling effort called Labour Listens. Its aim was to identify policies which matched the changing views of the British people.
Hello, Mr Lynch. I'm calling from the local Labour Party. I'm a local councillor. We're starting our Labour Listens campaign, where we're just seeking the views of ordinary people. We wonder if you could take...
The left was suspicious. They saw polling as a self-serving means of abandoning socialism.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why your Labour Party is into trouble, when you have people like Ben.
If the newspapers said the Labour Party was divided, which they always did, they'd say, do you think the Labour Party is divided? And then if the newspapers were saying the left is a threat, they'd say, do you think the left is a threat?
Please tell me whether the statement applies to any of the main parties. That's Labour, Conservative, the Alliance, the SDP. Seems very disorganised. Labour, Tory...
Labour all the way through.
Doesn't seem to have any clear policies. Labour, Tory, Alliance, SDP.
But there was no serious attempt to use that tool of research, which is a valuable one, for the purpose of getting across what we wanted to say and believed in. It was simply a mirror of what the Conservative media was saying about us, with a view to getting us to become as like the Conservatives as we could, in the hope that we would then somehow win their support.
We couldn't win an election just with the votes of the poor and the deprived and the ethnic minorities. My constituency is a constituency which is predominantly composed of voters who are poor and deprived, with a considerable number of people from the ethnic minorities. And I kept increasing my majority at every general election, but it didn't do my constituents any good, because what they needed was a different government. And the only way we could get a different government was by adding to the votes of the poor and the deprived and the ethnic minorities the votes of affluent people living in the southeast of England and in other parts of England.
As the policy review progressed, Neil Kinnock became isolated at Westminster. He was the object of constant sniping from his own side in the House of Commons, much of which was leaked to the press. Although he was moving the party in their direction, the old right-wingers remained scornful of him. They still regarded him as a lightweight and no match for Margaret Thatcher in the House of Commons. As time passed, Neil Kinnock felt beleaguered and embittered.
I was uneasy and I was deeply concerned. And some days I was depressed, yes. I mean, you'd have to be a madman not to be. Because every newspaper I opened was full of critical references.
The party held a series of meetings for senior members to thrash out the policy review. But they were overshadowed by the continued dissatisfaction with the leader.
There was always a clique, so it's unfair to describe it as a clique, but there was a group around Roy Hattersley, John Smith, Jack Cunningham, Donald Dewar, who'd all been together for a long time. And I think there was an underlying belief in the right-wing group in the Shadow Cabinet that our position, our fortunes could be transformed if only Neil could be removed and replaced, I think, by John Smith. I think by this time it was clear that perhaps Roy Hattersley's time had gone, and I think Roy himself was clear that it would be John Smith.
I think Brian's right. There were people doing that, of course, and it led to a lot of bad feeling, I think, between Neil and John in many ways. So Brian's right to say that.
John Smith, Kinnock's shadow chancellor, had served in the last Labour cabinet. His friends on the right admired his intellect and his command of the House of Commons, and they rated Smith's parliamentary skills above those of Neil Kinnock.
Even when he was doing marvels with the Labour Party in other ways, the House of Commons could be his Achilles heel. I say could be, because he did some terrific performances in the House of Commons, but you never knew with Neil. He could be terrific, or he could be rambling, or he could be terrible, or he could be workmanlike. With John Smith, for example, or with Roy Hattersley, you always knew there would be a certain minimum level of competence. Neil could rise to enormous heights, but I'm afraid he could fall to pretty low depths as well.
Increasingly, Kinnock relied on an inner circle of advisers, including Peter Mandelson, the party's Director of Communications. They were deployed to put the best gloss on the policy review and to limit the damage done by those who disagreed with it.
At that time, under the Neil leadership, people around him misused the media and their contacts with the media to do over and attack and undermine senior figures in the party who they were displeased with in some way. It was done to Michael Meacher, it was done to Brian Gould even, who'd been the golden boy of the 1987 election. It was done to John Prescott a number of times. I always thought it was disgraceful behaviour. I mean, here was a leadership that was claiming to want to reunite the party, using the media to attack senior levels of its own organisation.
When John Prescott defied the leadership and stood for deputy in 1988, some felt that Mandelson and others went too far when they briefed the press.
Well, I think to these advisers, there's a feeling, well, the leader feels, who'll rid me of this troublesome priest? And they play their part, and there's no doubt we felt very strongly about that. They weren't only whispering, they were pretty well shouting what they thought had to be a rubbishing of me. I was challenging the leadership concept, albeit that I was only running for the deputy leadership. They feared that I might do a lot better than I did. Certainly there was threats about whether people would stay in the job if I was elected, and all sorts of accusations made. But that's the nature of the political game. Most of them were proud of it, as you know. They never put their names to them, but you live with that in this game.
A series of articles appeared giving vent to Kinnock's fury and contempt. But Prescott and his friends could only speculate about who was behind these off-the-record briefings.
Well, I suspect two of the leading ones were Patricia Hewitt herself, Neil's press secretary, and certainly Peter Mandelson, who had a rather personality clash with John Prescott. John distrusted them because he felt that they were briefing journalists against him, and because he felt that they were the sort of people who were going behind the scenes saying, well, you know, shame about Prescott, rugged, down to earth, doesn't have a great deal upstairs, would be absolutely disastrous in a top position in the Labour Party. I think his suspicions were probably fairly well founded, although, as the event showed, it didn't make any difference long term.
I haven't heard anyone say this either to my face or behind my back. It doesn't fit in with my own recollection of events. The matters were dealt with between Neil Kinnock and John Prescott, and they're not things that I could comment on at this stage.
Brendan, what's his name? Bruce. Brendan Bruce.
Peter Mandelson became renowned for his skill in handling the media. Journalists relied on his briefings for good stories.
No, hold on a minute. Take that off. Hold on. Take that off.
His teasing, tongue-in-cheek style was used allegedly to brutal effect against senior party figures. In some sections of the party, his methods aroused deep concern and hostility.
I'm not going to comment on the drinking. Not commenting at all.
There's no doubt that he did have that influence, and he's able to see ahead how the press might react to things. And I think when you get very much caught up with the press and the media, people like Peter become extremely important as advisors in those areas, and I thought he had extraordinary influence beyond what he should have exercised, but I'm sure Peter would feel he was carrying out the job that he was expected to do. It's in that grey area of what you're doing for whom and who agrees it that we get these disagreements and the feelings of jealousy and the accusations of mythical power.
I know one or two members of the Shadow Cabinet got themselves in a bit of a twist about it all. I never had much patience for that, frankly. You see, I think they all knew that I would never appoint a hitman. If there was anything to be done, I'd do it myself.
And if you went to Neil and protested, as often shadow cabinet members did, because I wasn't the only targeted in that, Neil used to deny they were going on, and it wasn't his office. Well, we just all knew, frankly, that wasn't true. And whether he knew or not is another matter, but certainly his office were at it, and I don't think it was limited to Peter Mandelson.
In 1989, Michael Meacher, the Shadow Employment Secretary, was interviewed about trade union reform. This was a sensitive and unfinished area of the policy review, not yet agreed. To the leader's fury, Meacher suggested on the programme that Labour might restore the right to secondary picketing.
And secondary pickets.
In the following day's press, journalists quoted unnamed sources in the Labour Party who rubbished Meacher and hinted at his demotion.
Press briefings were given from Walworth Road by Peter Mandelson. I was one of those who were the victims of these briefings, which were designed to undermine and erode our position. A number of my shadow cabinet colleagues, whom I could name, were also part of that exercise.
Nobody was undermining anyone. What often the press office was doing was saving politicians from themselves, from their own gaffes and from the messes that they had created. And when somebody goes on television and does something which creates sort of palpable damage to the party and the message we're trying to get across, it has to be put right. It's all hands to the pump. I mean, people have to get on the phone and ring up so-and-so and say, well, he didn't mean to say this, and it's not quite like that, and well, actually, this is consistent with that, but, you know, we are moving toward... You know, it's complicated, it's difficult, it's damage limitation, it's elastoplast, it happens all the time. And the poor guy in the middle, you know, doesn't have an easy ride. He tends to get kicked by both sides, usually, and it was often the case.
No.
Michael Meacher, a left-winger, was duly replaced by Tony Blair as employment spokesman.
Sorry, it's previously time. Well, it's just on the government's...
Okay, well, look, no, hang on. If we're going to do this properly, let us do it properly.
Okay.
If you want...
Blair was always a moderniser, dedicated to the complete overhaul of the Labour Party.
I mean, I have never had any doubt as to what the Labour Party has to do in order to become a viable left-of-centre party of government again. I've never had any doubt about that. I mean, I know it sounds arrogant to say it, but to me, the values and principles of the Labour Party are what brought me into the Labour Party. You know, the belief in a strong and decent, cohesive society is necessary for the betterment of the individual. The belief in social justice, the need to combat the social and economic evils around us. But the means of achieving those have got to be different in today's world.
The government's intervention on the rail dispute has obviously raised it into a major political story.
Tony Blair and Peter Mandelson were extremely close.
Do you want to make your call, Tony?
Well, I'll do that.
Whether you're prepared to, endorse the rail.
It was said that Blair relied on Mandelson's advice, turning to him for guidance on his political advancement.
The advice I would have given to Tony Blair at the time was first of all to work out very clearly where you were going and what your end destination was going to be, and then to establish in your mind and with your colleagues a very clear route map as to how you were going to arrive there, and then get on with it, quietly, behind the scenes.
Many colleagues became convinced that Peter Mandelson had his own plan for the Labour Party, and that he was doing his utmost to ensure the advancement of a new generation of like-minded politicians.
I think John Prescott summed it up rather well. He called the group of people who were being promoted the beautiful people. By that, he was talking about a group of people like Tony Blair, Gordon Brown. And I think, in a sense, to understand that, you have to understand the politics of the Labour Party. And Peter Mandelson is on the far right of the Labour Party. And he was, in a sense, a player in the game. He wasn't a neutral servant of the party, didn't claim to be, didn't want to be. He wanted to be a player in the game. And so therefore he tended to promote those people whose views he felt were in line with his own.
I think that there was some interest in the question of who might in due course succeed Neil. And it was in Neil's interest and in the interest of some others that the successor should come from a younger group. It was therefore important that, it was hoped, I think, that Neil would hold on for long enough to see off someone like John Smith. Neil would win the election or would stay there for long enough, so that John's time would have gone. It was also clear at that point that Gordon Brown and Tony Blair were being ushered forward.
I don't think anybody should forget that, in fact, both of these men were Neil Kinnock protégés, and both of them benefited, I think, from his support immensely. I mean, Gordon in particular, and Neil used to often think of Gordon as his possible successor, because Gordon was, as everybody knows now, was kind of seen as the senior of the two.
Well, I think there's lots of politicians who've been tipped as future leaders, and I think it probably is a dangerous thing because you immediately become a target. But, I mean, that's part of politics. It thrives on talking about personalities when it ought to be spending more time, or the writing of it and the reporting of it, should probably spend more time looking at the policy issues and the, if you like, the debate within parties and between parties about the important policies.
By 1991, Neil Kinnock's policy review had been completed, and Labour once again launched itself as a modernised party, ready for power. The party had now rejected many of the policies once regarded as fundamental to Labour. Gone was the commitment to unilateral nuclear disarmament, once Kinnock's most sincerely held belief. Out went wholehearted support for public ownership and union rights. To the left, Margaret Thatcher was the inspiration.
The policy review was designed to bring us into line with the main tenets of government policy, and then somehow to present ourselves as better able to administer policies that were really dictated by the thinking of the Prime Minister. And that was one reason why it wasn't very credible to the electorate.
Privatisation had gone to such an extent that we simply could not afford to buy back the public utilities. International politics were changing. There was a new middle class which wanted something different in terms of housing and in terms of pensions and social security. But it wasn't an ideological change brought about by Mrs. Thatcher. It was a change in the world which needed democratic socialism to be applied in a different fashion.
But Neil Kinnock's change of heart, especially on nuclear weapons, was widely regarded as a sign of political immaturity.
I think that the mistake was that this was a change too far, that people's feeling, heavily presented by the Conservative Party, reinforced by the right-wing media, who you have to remember at this time were universally anti-Kinnock, who were vehemently having a go at him personally, that they were able to use this as an indication, A, that he would change his mind even on the most crucial thing that he'd presented himself as being solidly behind, and secondly, that therefore you couldn't trust the party.
I've put in a call for Charles.
Neil Kinnock's advisers now attempted to control the leader's image. His natural, but sometimes embarrassing, ebullience was curbed. At carefully staged photo opportunities, he was dressed in black suits with white shirts and a regimental tie.
I think that Neil Kinnock and those around him thought Neil had to be like Mrs. Thatcher in order to be the Prime Minister of Britain. And I think they squashed him into suits that didn't suit him, you know, chopped off his long hair, tidied him up, made him paler, changed him to be as big as her. And I think there was an error in it. Because, of course, by the time she went, the whole country heaved an enormous sigh of relief that Major was so not like her and was so much like an ordinary bloke with a big smile. They might regret it now, but they wanted something different, not another version of her.
The arrival of John Major in Downing Street, a man who made a virtue of his modest background, wrong-footed Labour. It led inevitably to renewed agitation among the old guard for Neil Kinnock's replacement by John Smith.
Some people allege that John Smith had a game plan to replace Neil as leader of the party. That was put to me by a lot of people. I, in fact, discussed it with John at one point over this period. I believed that was entirely untrue. However, I have to say that after the election, after the 92 election, one or two people in very senior positions indicated to me that John had been talking in a disloyal way in ways that I intended to discount.
Behind the friendly smiles in public, a gulf had opened up between John Smith, the Shadow Chancellor, and Neil Kinnock. Smith believed that Labour's tax plan should be kept secret to the last minute. Kinnock wanted them thrashed out in public.
As far as taxation issues, there was a difference of approach between Neil and John Smith, the Shadow Chancellor, and his team. I remember a member of the Shadow Cabinet urging me to have a simple 10-point question and answer what our taxation policy should be. And we drafted it because John Smith wouldn't draft it. And I showed him the draft over Christmas 91, New Year 92, and we went to a Shadow Cabinet meeting in a hotel in Kensington in early 92, and I said, look, we really are keen that there should be clarity on these issues. Neil's very keen that there should be clarity on these issues, but John felt it was better to not to be clear on those issues. And there was a lot of difficulties and tensions on these matters.
Eventually, 5 days after the general election was called, on the 16th of March 1992, John Smith presented his shadow budget to the public in a ceremony designed to mimic the real thing.
Huge confidence was reposed in John's image as the trustworthy bank manager. The people who ran the campaign in 1992 genuinely believed, I think, that if they could only wheel John out often enough, they could deal with all of this. Our much maligned posters warned us throughout that we were on very shaky ground, and that if once the Tories got their act together on tax, we would be defeated.
If there was any disparity, I wouldn't even say disagreement, in the view that I had and some others had, it was based on that I thought it was a long slog, that I thought it was a week by week, month by month, year by year affair. And others thought that you could afford to have the fireworks just before or even during the election campaign. I think history tends to be on my side.
The conduct of Labour's campaign for the 1992 general election reflected the divisions and tensions within the party.
That's fine. You just nail it in there, then it's picture framed by the white surround.
In the absence of Peter Mandelson, who was himself running for Parliament, the Labour campaign lacked overall control.
I think it's fair to say that we came close to management meltdown as far as our client was concerned. What I mean by management meltdown is that there was no clear command structure, no one at the top of that command structure who was clearly in control, no clear lines of authority and responsibility emitting from that command structure or the person who was at the top of that command structure. And the politicians were getting very unhappy and with the whole thing as well.
The difficulties came to a head when Labour's communications agency produced and broadcast a video which became known as Jennifer's Ear. The video looked at the differences between private and public health care. But a row broke out when questions were asked about the identity of the people behind the stories.
This was a clear example where presentation had got to the point that it was no longer under political control, and where a whole broadcast had been prepared without the participation or the knowledge of the spokesperson involved. I firmly believe that it is important that, yes, we use communication experts, yes, we use the skills of people who can put across our message more effectively than we can, but we have to remain in control of the message.
The triumph of the medium over the message reached its zenith in Sheffield the week before polling.
The brief was simple, that we should have the biggest political rally since the war. And we did, therefore, from the beginning, look at big venues and that it was going to be a big event. There was no question of it. We decided very early on that we would give a three-line whip to all the Shadow Cabinet to be present, and I asked for a budget of £150,000 and was given it.
And now it's time for us to move outside the arena
Neil Kinnock arrived in a helicopter, which we saw on the big screen, and we saw him get out and walk across and get into his car. And then the screen showed a sequence of the campaign so far, which gave him chance to drive round this huge arena.
Here, inside the Sheffield Arena, Neil and Glenys Kinnock.
He made then a grand entrance from the side of the arena. He then made a relatively short walk to a sort of royal box, which was right at the other end facing the platform.
I was personally horrified at the way the presentation overrode what could have been a substantial event in terms of illustrating support in a literal rally of confidence for the last week. And the things that horrified me was the Californian, the Los Angeles presentation, as though we were on a film set, and the way in which the Shadow Cabinet were presented on the platform as the government of the country. They were grave errors of presentation.
It's now time to meet the men and women who will form the next government. Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Smith. And now, it is time for the next Prime Minister, Neil Kinnock.
And then he came up to the lectern and turned and said, completely unscripted,
"Well, all right. Well, all right. Well, all right. Well, all right."
That was the 5 seconds they put on the 9 o'clock news. And that was not a future Prime Minister. That was a leader of an opposition party.
We better get some talking done here, serious talking. We're on our way to victory. In 9 days' time, Britain will have a Labour government.
This roar hit me. And for a couple of seconds I responded to it. And all of the years in which I'd attempted to sort of build a fairly reserved and starchy persona, for a few seconds they all slipped away.
I think that, you know, I've actually said before that I loved Neil Kinnock, but I also saw his shortcomings, and I saw them through my own eyes because I think they are the shortcomings that I would have if I was in that job. And they were the shortcomings about a kind of very ordinary guy with very ordinary instincts that hadn't really been tamed, if you like, even by all the political advisors. So on occasions like that, there was always the chance that he would do something that the average football supporter would do. And he did it. And he did it more than once. And people used to go, "Oh my God, no, Neil, you haven't done that again."
Thank you all for coming tonight and helping to make this a truly memorable occasion.
Had Neil been able to follow his own instincts, had he not been surrounded more closely with people who were telling him different things, I think he would have been able to respond more easily to what was happening outside. What they failed to grasp is that it is the root feeling that you touch when you're out there as a politician that got you in the job in the first place that makes the difference between success and failure. Even John Major in 1992 on his soapbox being ridiculed understood that.
Can you hear? Don't let the people who take to the streets.
The contrast between the grandeur of the Sheffield rally and John Major's street campaign could not have been more marked. Labour, the party of the masses, found itself fighting a Conservative leader who made the most of being a man of the people.
I think that the 92 election campaign was doomed from the start. I remember
in my constituency, which is a safe Labour seat, the through roads from the suburbs and from Cheshire being lined with huge posters which said nothing but "you can't trust Labour." And I thought, what a stupid poster, and why are they wasting all that money on that? It was the cleverest political poster that there's been for very many years, because what it was doing was drawing on an emotion which was present in the minds of a great many people. We didn't lose that election because of Kinnock, and we didn't lose that election because of the Sheffield Rally, and we didn't lose that election because of tax. Kinnock, the Sheffield Rally, and tax were all outward symbols of "you can't trust Labour," and that's why we lost.
Defeat in 1992 spelt the end of Neil Kinnock's leadership of the Labour Party.
Neil Kinnock, in my view, coped brilliantly. There was all the same nonsense about, you know, it's an elite running the party, he's too authoritarian. I mean, heavens above, the Labour Party was in a state of disintegration when he took it over. If he hadn't exercised some control and authority, the party would have fallen apart. And you know, most ordinary Labour Party members, most Labour voters want a party that is properly led. If he hadn't done it, we would never have won the number of seats we did at the 92 election.
I naturally feel a strong sense of disappointment. Not for myself, for I am fortunate, very fortunate in my personal life. But I feel dismay, sorrow for so many people in our country who do not share this personal good fortune. They deserve better than they got on the 9th of April 1992.
Do you intend to stay on as party leader, Mr. Kinnock?
I accepted blame because I was to blame. I don't think you can lead a party to 2 successive electoral defeats and consider yourself to be free of blame. That's not even grown up. You cannot, I repeat, lead a party to defeat twice and consider yourself to be a success. There were some successes, but overall, no one would pass an exam with the marks that I got for electoral victories. No one would win a game having played brilliantly on a few occasions, but never crossed the try line.
Sure enough, John Smith, the Scottish lawyer and favoured candidate of Labour's old guard, inherited the crown. Backed by the trade unions, the bandwagon in his favour was unstoppable.
He clearly was not a Kinnock person, and indeed there were those who wanted him to replace Neil before the 1992 election, thinking perhaps rightly that we might have had a better chance. But he was part of that era. We were all part of that era, and he was part of that too.
John Smith had suffered a severe heart attack in 1989. In the years that followed, he worked hard to maintain his health.
I suppose the really almost comic side of it was the constant struggle over his weight. This became a matter of some public interest as well at various times. I mean, John was someone who ate heartily, always had, and he was built a bit like a barrel, and that caused some problems, and I think probably more difficult for him than anything else was putting that problem behind him.
But at Westminster, John Smith's low-key style caused increasing frustration among the young modernisers. One MP described the party as sleepwalking into the next election.
It's, I think, fairly obvious now that there were people around in the shadow cabinet
who, had they been in the leadership at the time, would have done things differently. And we made some suggestions to John about how he should operate, but he took a different view.
Hello, hello. How are you? I'm Peter Mandelson, standing for Labour, for Parliament, for the town. How are you? Right, it's a bit cold.
Peter Mandelson, a keen moderniser, had left his job as Director of Communications to become an MP in 1992.
How are you going to vote, Adam? He's a Labour man. Look at that smile. He saw me and there's a broad smile.
His communication skills and exploitation of the media didn't find favour with John Smith, and Mandelson's fervent belief in the need for Labour to change rapidly was not shared by the new leader.
I think there was a sense, a year into the Parliament, that having experienced our rather severe and very depressing sort of dousing of with cold water at the election in '92, and realising that we really had to shake things up and go further and do a lot more if we were going to be electable, and certainly not repeat the mistakes that we had made at the election, that perhaps had sort of worn off. I think it was a sort of complacency, a touch of complacency came in.
John Smith had pledged himself to satisfy one of the demands of the modernisers, reducing the power of the unions in electing the party leader. But in typical style, he pushed through the measure, one member, one vote, with the help of a man who'd been marginalised in the Kinnock era.
He sent for me and said, "John, I've made a calculation, I'm going to lose by 7 points. And I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Yes." I said to him, "Have you done a deal with the trade union?" He said, "I don't do any more deals now. There comes a time when I must make my decision. I've made my decision, and I want to win, and I want you to help me win." He also told me that if he didn't win, he would resign.
There's no doubt this man, our leader, put his head on the block by saying, basically, "I fervently believe," because that's what he believes, "of a relationship, and a strong one, with the trade unions and the Labour Party." He's put his head there. Now's our time to vote. Give us a bit of trust, and let's have this vote support.
Funny enough, into my brain came, he's put his head on the block, and my brain rejected it, and I'm talking all the time saying no. Because if he loses, I can see all these pictures on the television where they chop off his head. And I thought, I can't use that, but I knew the moment required that. And so I said it and risked it, and hopefully it made a contribution.
The modernisers feared that having scored a victory, Smith would simply rest on his laurels and go no further down the path of reform.
I'm sure you won't need them, John, but be fortified in the knowledge of our devotion to you during weddings. Thank you for the present. I think I could have done with them about half an hour, actually, before the vote.
He was a great believer in party unity, almost at any cost, even if it meant not facing up to one or two awkward choices and difficult, ticklish issues that we needed to address in the party, which of course Tony Blair has done subsequently. So I think young people in the party in particular, felt that there's sort of a one last heave, or one more heave mentality was creeping into the party. And that at the end of the day, however well we seemed to be doing in the middle of the Parliament, that would not serve us successfully and decisively when the next election came along.
On the evening of the 11th of May 1994, John Smith attended a fundraising dinner with Labour supporters and senior politicians at the Park Lane Hotel. Although Smith had suffered a heart attack 5 years previously, his colleagues felt he'd now made a full recovery.
As luck would have it, and it was very lucky, he unusually was sitting next to me at the dinner and had taken the opportunity to bring me up to date with all sorts of gossip, and also discussions that he'd been having with other political leaders and things of this kind. And had a long chat and a full exchange of information.
And I remember him being full of joviality, coming across after he'd made a speech which was substantially off the cuff, not from notes, coming across to Elizabeth and saying, "How was that?" and both of us turning simultaneously and saying it was superb, and feeling that we were going somewhere.
John the next day was due to go campaigning in Essex, and I myself was going to Kent, and he ruefully said to me that we both had an early start the next morning, we shouldn't have stayed up so late. And I said, well, just think how far the party's come, John. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been campaigning in Essex or Kent.
Westminster is in mourning over the death of the Labour leader, John Smith. He was killed by a heart attack this morning.
Despite full medical attention to Mr. Smith, he was pronounced dead at 9:15 on the 12th of May.
I was in Aberdeen the morning that John died, and I remember very vividly because I was just about to start a series of visits, and a telephone call came through saying that John had a heart attack, and then another call came through shortly after that to say that he died. And it was a huge, I mean, it's impossible to describe the shock that comes upon you, because he was a close friend. He had really helped me into Parliament in many ways. He was someone who was an extraordinarily strong character and personality to be with. He'd been through a difficult period of time because of the changes he'd brought about in the Labour Party, one member, one vote, and so forth, but he was more or less over that. The party was in very good shape, and it was a devastating shock. It was devastating politically, and it was devastating personally.
I was devastated. The sense of political loss was far outweighed by the sense of personal grief, and I cried. I was very, very upset and sad about this.
He was kind and open. He had the instinctive support for people who were less advantaged than he and his family and friends were. And so it was a tragedy, not only in personal terms, but in political terms, when we all experienced his sudden loss. It was awful.
The question is, this House to now adjourn. This is Margaret Beckett.
I think my own colleagues were in shock, just devastated. And it was, I've never known the House in such a mood.
There are few people, the announcement of whose death would bring tears to the eyes of everyone who knew them. John Smith was such a man.
In the occasion in the House, I felt I must not let the party down. In general terms, that we had an election to fight very soon, of crucial importance, that we had inherited a precious legacy from John of public standing and trust, and that nothing must happen that put that at risk or in jeopardy.
With indecent haste, the party and press started to speculate on whom might succeed John Smith. While Tony Blair spoke only of his grief, his name was put forward by elder statesmen.
Well, it was an unsuitable time to choose because it was that very morning, I think, when I was interviewed in Brighton. I thought that the combination of Blair and Prescott, each having the qualities the other lacked, would be unbeatable. And the reason why I suggested Blair was that he had an element of charisma, magic if you like, about him, which nobody else in the party had to that degree, and which we desperately needed.
Shortly before he died, John Smith himself had accepted that Blair was the man most likely to succeed him.
It was the Monday of the week that he died, and I was in the office with him, and one of the members of staff that were in the press office, Mike Elric, had bet him some money to lose a bit of weight, to sort of set a target. So I made a comment about, well, we all do it, and it'll be a bigger amount and bigger target. And there was some exchange about how, he's got to look after himself, and he said, yeah, he's got to look after the heart. And I said, yes, I said it would be pretty awkward if something happened now. And quick as a flash, he turned around and said, well, what would happen if I disappeared? And what do you think would happen? And before I could answer, he said, it's got to be Tony, hasn't it?
Almost the moment that John died, when I was obviously in a state of shock, I'd lost a very close friend and someone I admired tremendously. Within half an hour of his death, then the whole subject started to change as to who was going to succeed him as leader. And it was, those few days were certainly the most traumatic I've ever experienced in politics and never want to experience again, because you were coping with a good deal of grief, genuine grief for him personally, and there were agonizing and difficult political decisions to be made.
I found Tony as soon as I felt I decently could after John Smith's death, and said, you've got to stand for leadership. You're the obvious candidate. You're most likely to win both the leadership election and the general election. Not only will I back you, but so will everybody I know will back you. You are the candidate, you must stand. And Tony's first reaction was that Gordon had hoped for the leadership, rather anticipated that it might come his way after John Smith had done 5 or 10 years. He never thought of it in those terms, and he was very apprehensive about hurting Gordon. He talked about hurting Gordon.
Well, I think people should understand that Tony and I talked constantly from the minute that John Smith died, when in fact I think I was the first person to tell Tony that John was dead. And I continued to talk to him for a long period of time as events unfolded. Of course, the people had asked us not to declare our intentions until after the European elections, which were some weeks away, but I felt I had to clear the air.
Peter Mandelson was close to both Brown and Blair. Indeed, they were sometimes regarded as his protégés. After Smith's death, Mandelson played a key role in the party's choice of leader.
I think the initial plan revolved around Gordon. I think Tony Blair was a fallback position. In the event, I think Tony emerged as much more voter-friendly than Gordon, and so perhaps horses were swapped midstream.
I have absolutely no intention of expressing any comment whatsoever on any aspect of the leadership campaign.
Gordon Brown was handed the revolver and did the decent thing.
We had to make a decision because there was no point in Tony Blair and I standing against each other. We were such close colleagues. We'd worked together over a very long period of time. We had worked on many issues related to the modernisation of the Labour Party, and we had, of course, our own supporters and our own friends, but I recognised it was important for there not to be a contest between the two of us.
If Tony wasn't a candidate, Gordon would certainly be my choice, but choices had been made. And Tony said, well, I'm not quite sure how I'm going to put it to him. What do I say to him? And I said, you tell him there's been a lot of people in the past who've wanted to be leader of the Labour Party and have come to terms with the fact they weren't going to be, and he has to be part of the line which goes back for a very long way.
You have to make up your mind, and it's not so much that you disregard what other people who may be going for the leadership are thinking, but you've got to decide what is the best thing for your party, what is the best thing for your family, what is the best thing for those that are closest to you, and it's a difficult decision.
I was sort of an outsider to the bandwagon for Tony Blair because it doesn't work for me. I now recognise that I'm a sort of minority, because for most people in the country it does work. A young, very upper middle class, sort of attractive young man. It isn't my kind of image of where the Labour leadership should come from. A very useful senior member of a cabinet, maybe, but I've been proved to be wrong in that the overwhelming majority of all bits of the Labour Party thought Tony was the best possible leadership, and the public like him very much. I think the party said, well, we need this kind of leader to win, but we want to be ourselves, so we'll choose Tony and we'll anchor him with John.
I think we're complementary, like salt and pepper. He has a vision of the sort of changes he wants. It comes from his experience, and he knows what needs to be done for the Labour Party. My experience is entirely different, reflects a different experience and background, but those two things are the nature of the Labour Party. Some call it the heart and head. I'd like to think I've got a head as well as a heart, but I think there's a lot to be said for that, and together I think we can produce, for the Labour Party at last, a Labour government.
On the 20th of May 1994, leading figures past and present gathered in Scotland to bury John Smith. With his death, a link with Labour's past had been severed. A new generation with a very different outlook was poised to take over.
I think the strategy now is to dismantle the Labour Party, as we know it, linked to the unions with a sense of history and some vision as to what could be done, and to transform it into a democratic party like the American, and to perhaps make it impossible for socialists to remain in the party, whereas previously they were there, but they were accepted. Now I don't know that they will be accepted.
I think it's been a painful process, a painful withdrawal from hope and idealism. It may or may not have been necessary. I don't believe that it was, and I think we have simply given up. And we will secure power, but I don't think we'll make much of it. And we will, as soon as the voters recover their confidence in the Tories, we'll be removed in order to make room for the real thing.
If we end up torturing ourselves with this belief that all this modernisation process is an attempt to sort of shadow the Conservatives or become like the Conservatives, then we'll just fail. I mean, we'll just be completely doomed to failure. Because every part of sensible change, bringing the Labour Party back as a mainstream party, speaking up for people, will go. And we'll end up just as a sort of sect, which is what we were in the early 1980s.
Many of the party's elder statesmen fear that Labour, in its quest for power, is in danger of losing sight of its founding principles.
We had a big idea, which was a more equal, therefore a more free society. Sometimes we called it fairness, sometimes we called it social justice, but our idea was a more equal and more free society. Now that was the idea we should have propagated with determination and consistency, the idea we should have sold to the people, the idea we failed to sell to the people, but it's still the idea, and it's the only idea that socialism can possibly stand for.
You've always got to have in mind with a Labour Party that if it isn't a radical party, if it isn't a party of change, if it isn't a party that's committed to making Britain a fairer, more equal society, then that idealism and that enthusiasm, that energy that goes with that will be denied it. And if the Labour Party plays too safe for too long, it will really be denying its own heritage.
Since the party's bitter divisions of the early 80s, the strategy of the party's leaders has been to gain power by moving to the centre ground. The old left, for all its complaint, has not succeeded in selling an alternative vision of Labour. For a generation, Labour politicians have spent their careers in opposition. They've seen Britain transformed by a powerful and radical Conservative leader. They have never tasted the fruits of power, and their political legacy will be a party which has rejected almost everything it stood for when, 16 years ago, it was cast into the wilderness.